All right, welcome everyone. I'm Benjamin Day,
I'm Stephanie Nakajima.
and this is Medicare for All, the podcast for everybody who needs healthcare.
Woo. All right, so inspiration for today's podcast came from this news article on Twitter that I ran across that said that 62% of people now have a positive opinion of drug companies. And that's up from last year when it was only 32%. So we've really gone, and of course, public opinion is variable depending on what's going on in the news. It can go up and down, although I think that's quite a large leap. But we've gone from this, Martin Shkreli, Pharma Bro era to this apparently real rehabilitation of the pharmaceutical industry's reputation through the COVID-19 vaccine, and basically as our global saviors from this pandemic. So today we're going to take a look at whether they actually deserve this newly found positive opinion.
Spoiler alert. No, they don't. I had totally forgotten about Martin Shkreli until just this moment. Thank you for reminding me of all that trauma. So we have an amazing guest today. Shannon Rotolo is a clinical pharmacy specialist at the University of Chicago Medicine. She's also one of the co-founders of Pharmacists for Single Payer. Yay!
Group.
Welcome, Shannon, to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited.
So to start with, I'm just curious, as a pharmacist, how did you end up getting involved with the Medicare for All movement?
Sure. So I've been a pharmacist for a little over 10 years. I spent most of my earlier years working in inpatient settings where you really don't run into as many issues related to insurance or pharmacy benefit managers as a pharmacist in the inpatient world, so meaning that I worked in a hospital, mostly in children's hospitals. Every now and then this would come up, right? We'd want to discharge a patient, so a child that needed an antibiotic to go home on wouldn't be covered, and they'd end up staying in the hospital some additional days while we tried to sort out how we could safely get them home. But most of the time it wasn't, you have the medications that are on formulary in a hospital, wasn't too much of a focus for me. And then a few years ago, I switched to work primarily in outpatient areas, so not so much community pharmacy, but more in clinics with my physician and other healthcare worker colleagues, and in a specialty pharmacy role later, working with really high cost drugs. So I think it was there that I definitely started to encounter how much of a barrier our current system is in terms of getting my patients the medications that they needed. So I guess through that experience, I suppose, I got pretty fired up about that, made some friends who were involved in Physicians for a National Health Program, and got more involved on both with that organization and then on a state level as well.
Yeah, it feels good to, take action, doesn't it?
Yes.
Kinds of things, yeah. So to start with this topic, so many people, particularly now during the era of COVID, see the primary function of pharmaceutical companies as discovering and manufacturing important new drugs. Is that what pharma actually does today?
So it is a small piece of what pharma does, but if you're thinking about large pharmaceutical companies, they do a lot of other things. They do sometimes do some in-house research and development, but a lot of the R&D that's being done is by smaller biotech or biomed companies, where the larger pharmaceutical companies, like the names that we know, will go out and buy that intellectual property, and then a huge amount of what they do after their operations and like production of those products is marketing or ads or promotion of those products. Yeah. And there's, I don't know if you've probably seen this video. There's a great movie out there by the Fix-It group called Big Pharma Market Failure, and I think they describe that process really well. Just this idea of R&D being done by a lot of smaller companies, and the larger names that we know in pharma really being marketing firms, essentially.
And anyone who's turned on a television in the last 10 years probably gets a sense of the scale of how much marketing gets done. And I imagine some of this happens also behind closed doors. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think kind of the
or with providers is what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah, so the ads that we see on TV or magazines are part of that marketing. There's also promotion through kind of like glossy sheets that get handed out to physicians, to me if I meet with a drug rep, right? There's kind of that schmoozing component. There's the swag. There's the opportunities to speak or interactions with pharma at conferences. So you're often meeting with someone where it's really a sales rep, right? And they do have folks that work for those companies. And I have pharmacist friends who work for those companies that are medical science liaisons and, do other roles there. Those exist. But a lot of the provider facing folks in pharma are essentially sales reps.
Right.
Yeah, there's like this running gag on Scrubs, which is kind of an old show, so maybe most people won't know about it, but where like the pharma rep comes in and they're always like this gorgeous, like hunky dude or like, really attractive woman to talk to the doctors about the drugs. And I'm like, can we just like dispatch hot people to talk about single payer to like Congress or something? Like, I'm sure that this is like actually part of the whole, this is what they spend their money on.
Yes. Yeah, it's absolutely where the money is getting spent is ads, is promoting those products to people who may prescribe them or may recommend them to patients. And then of course, like profits and shareholders and all of that. But if you really looked at a breakdown of where the money gets spent, it's not on research and development.
Right. And so when we look at these big, major innovative breakthroughs in drug development and drug research, who is actually paying for that if it's not these big pharma companies that we all know and hate, or used to hate until this last year?
Sure. So a lot of that is actually funded by, whether you want to call it taxpayers or the NIH, essentially. It's, basic science that's absolutely critical for later drug development and discoveries. It's biomedical research. It's the preclinical work, it's the translational work, even clinical trials. So the NIH is one of the huge funders. You do occasionally see studies funded through like the VA if it's a later phase clinical trial or other programs that are still not a drug company, right?
VA still cares, right?
But yeah, just different routes that ultimately are sort of more public funding. And I think some good examples of that, there's a huge one a few years ago now, I guess, that kind of blew up in the media with Truvada and Descovy. So taking a drug that had been fully developed with taxpayer dollars years ago, and then Gilead Sciences taking that US government-owned patent and actually making an extremely profitable drug that's very high cost and can be less accessible to patients because of that very high cost, and really running wild with that.
So it sounds like you're painting a picture here where the public, i.e. our existing single-payer systems or public systems, are doing a lot of the basic research, the things that are risky, may or may not pay off. So we bear all the risk as the public. And then when something succeeds and makes a breakthrough, somehow it ends up in the hands of these big pharmaceutical companies, which then just take them and try to find ways to force patients to use them. Is that about
so
right?
We get to pay for them all over again a second time and can't pay enough the first time.
I was going to say, just to be crystal clear about it, I feel like it really undercuts the arguments made by pharmaceutical companies. The two main ones I hear, number one is that they can't lower the price because they do research and development. Not true. Or very different picture, right? And then number two is that price controls would cut innovation or the interest in innovation. And that's also something that's really not true, since most pharmaceutical companies aren't doing a lot of that kind of ground level research that needs to be done to develop really truly new innovative drugs. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so speaking of, innovation, what exactly is a Metoo drug? And could you give us an example of what a Metoo drug is?
Sure. So a Me Too drug would be something where there is already another medication that is FDA approved in that same category. So we see tons of these, right? Like certain classes of blood pressure medications, certain classes of cholesterol medications. So probably everyone knows at least someone who's on a statin, right? But there's so many different statins. Those are all Me Too drugs. One that I encounter a lot in my work, because I work mostly with pulmonary clinics, is inhalers. There are a lot of different inhaler products, and these are kind of unlike some of those older blood pressure or cholesterol medications. Some of these are really expensive. It can cost, even after having insurance, I'll have patients that have a $200 something, $300 something copay for an inhaler every month. So those are kind of another class where there are a lot of options or Me Too's on the market, but that hasn't even helped with price, like some of those other ones, like blood pressure meds or cholesterol meds.
And what is like the pharmaceuticals industry's incentive to create another drug?
So I think the examples that I just gave are the really common disease states, right? So you have the possibility, if you end up being the most popular one, you have the possibility of being a blockbuster drug, right? So many Americans have high blood pressure. So many Americans have high cholesterol. So many Americans have asthma or COPD or a reason to use a corticosteroid inhaler. So there's a large market there, right? Unlike some smaller rare diseases where even if you are the drug of choice, even if you have kind of the whole piece of that pie of who needs this type of medication, you're really not going to sell to that many people or that many lives, right? So I think that kind of creates some weird incentives. There's also a lot of other things that create weird incentives, the way that we handle patent laws here. There's a whole kind of murky mess of why our drugs that are approved by the FDA or drugs that are created to even get to that phase to submit for FDA approval tend to focus on what's lucrative instead of on what the global disease burden is.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, one thing about these Me Too's, like you had said, for blood pressure, you could see a list of 1 million drugs to basically do the same thing. And some of them are very, very old generics, like the old diuretics. When they invent a new drug that's basically addressing this same disease that there's already a lot of drugs that address, do they have to prove that it's better than the other drugs already in the market? And how do we know as patients or even as providers, as doctors, when a new drug comes on the market, if it's better than what's already laying around on the shelf?
Yeah, so there's no requirement to do a head-to-head comparison and really no funding for that even after these drugs get approved. So I'm thinking of some of the drugs that I work with in the specialty pharmacy space, some of these really new high-cost medications where they have the same target or work in the same way. They're not compared head-to-head. You end up, whichever one that prescriber is more comfortable with or uses more often is probably the one that's going to get prescribed. Or frankly, the one that your insurance is willing to cover is the one that you're going to end up on. When you do have those things where there's multiple drugs in the same class, but you'll really never see a really well-designed randomized controlled trial comparing those. You'll see them get approved based on comparisons to placebo. And sometimes you'll see comparisons, after the fact, retrospective studies, but those can be hard to interpret because they're not designed the way those very robust clinical trials that the FDA wants submitted are designed.
So you could even say, based off of what I'm hearing about these Me Too drugs, that the profit motive is actually working against the innovation motive. Because if you can make a profit by tweaking a drug and then repackaging it, then you have more of an incentive to make money doing that than you would going down a rabbit hole trying to find a truly innovative drug and maybe or maybe not getting somewhere with it.
Well, and sometimes it pays off not to even tweak something, but just the kind of the medication itself, but the delivery device, right? So I've worked with medications that they came out on the market available only in a vial. So a nurse would draw that up in an office and administer it to a patient if it was something that was injectable. And now there's an auto injector available. So now the auto injector is going to remain a brand name product for longer, right? Because you have a new delivery device, even though the drug is exactly the same. The drug companies will kind of do creative things to try and stay preferred on formularies of pharmacy benefit managers, to sort of essentially like offering higher rebates back to pharmacy benefit managers so that they get chosen to be the preferred product more often than their competitors. And it's just kind of wild. There's like a lot of gaming and evergreening and things like that happen related to patents, to ensure that they're getting the longest high cost frame of time that they can sell you that brand name drug.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about patents because, I mean, you were hinting at the sneaky ways that they find to extend their patents. I mean, how long is a basic drug patent anyway? Can you still get a patent even if the government basically invented your drug? And what are the ways that pharmaceutical companies find sneaky ways to extend their patent beyond, what should be legal?
So there's a lot of ways to get different sort of timeframes of patents. So there are things that the government has essentially tried to incentivize. So there are some rare diseases where, kind of how we were talking about earlier with Metoo drugs, there aren't a lot of patients that have those rare diseases. So there may be in that case, a drug company that has, or a biotech company that has something that they could potentially bring to market that would be helpful for those rare diseases. But the incentive to do it, you'd have to charge a ton for that drug for them to consider it lucrative enough or profitable enough. But they're able to maybe charge that high price, but also get these extended patents through the Orphan Drug Act. And then there's separate ones for tropical diseases, all kinds of things, to kind of get a longer patent in the first place. And a lot of the drugs that we see coming to market now, are 80% of the drugs that were approved, or roughly 80% for the past several years, have been in the specialty pharmacy space. So biologics that are often used for rare diseases that are going to have some of those longer patents due to orphan drug status. So
interesting.
Yeah, there are a lot of little games that can be played.
Yeah, so the basic patent is usually like 20 years or something like that, right? And then it sounds like they've created these new categories that immediately the drug industry is rushing into to take advantage of these longer patents. Is that about right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Wonderful. And you had mentioned, what are some of the other ways that once they have a patent and it expires, which takes a long time, apparently much longer than 20 years in some cases, how do they cling to that monopoly and avoid competition even after their patent expires? You had already mentioned one of these tactics, but I think it was just like changing the delivery method, right, to a shot or something like that.
Yeah, and that kind of changes to the delivery method is something that we saw with insulin and even with different EpiPens or other epinephrine products on the market. But another strategy that both of those, both like some of the insulin products and epinephrine that we've seen, is the generic does come to market eventually after a bunch of lawsuits and things to try and delay that process. But it'll be that same drug company making their own generic. Right. So again, still controlling the market, still being able to set whatever price they want. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we've seen with epinephrine and with some of the insulin products too.
Right. And maybe you can explain to me. I have this memory that like when Prozac went off patent, that it was like immediately repatented for premenstrual disorder for like a different use. Can you do that? Can you literally repatent a drug just for like a slightly different usage, or?
So expanded indications. That's pretty common. A drug that comes to mind that I think a lot of folks may recognize just because it's such a blockbuster drug in the specialty pharmacy world that I work in is Humira. Humira can be used for all kinds of things now, right? So that's definitely getting an extended FDA label is another way to further extend your patent.
And what is that drug used for? I'm not actually familiar with it. But
So I'd say most commonly is used for gastrointestinal conditions like Crohn's disease, but all different indications now.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and moving on, I guess, to what's going on in Congress right now. So, for 15 years, so this is how long the issue of allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices, this is how long it's been going on, right? Back in 2006, 15 years ago, Nancy Pelosi said that Democrats were going to repeal this, at that time, fairly new ban on Medicare negotiating drug prices. So, now there's, of course, and there always has been, widespread support among Democrats for this idea. In fact, widespread support among the American population for it. But Joe Biden has left it out of the infrastructure plan, and he is also expected to leave it out of his budget. So just a couple questions about the whole, Medicare negotiation thing. What prices, if Medicare isn't negotiating, what prices does Medicare pay now for drugs?
So Medicare is kind of a weird, interesting world when it comes to drugs now, because you have drugs that are available through the Part B plans, which everybody has kind of the same Part B setup, right? Where it's a drug that's used at a clinic or at a doctor's office. You go in, you expect that you're paying 20% of that copay, regardless of, unless you have like a secondary insurance or something. So those are, I think of like infusible chemotherapies and other injectable drugs. Then you've got the stuff that you pick up at a pharmacy counter, which is happening under Part D. So a lot of, I think, the benefit of being able to negotiate drug prices actually happens sort of on the Part B side with some of those really expensive chemotherapies and things like that. If Medicare was able to negotiate, like those were kind of the drugs that were mostly listed on those target lists that had been circulating last year. But Part D drugs are kind of their own weird world, because Part D is really facilitated by pharmacy benefit managers, right? So the same way that private insurance prescription drug benefits are facilitated by these pharmacy benefit managers, you have this sort of extra middleman in there.
Just a question about pharmacy benefit managers. What are they?
Okay, so a pharmacy benefit manager is a separate entity from an insurance company that the insurance company or a large employer, or in the case we were just talking about, Medicare Part D, contracts with to facilitate prescription drug benefits. So if you're a large drug company like Aetna, you don't want to touch that. That is really complicated. You are worried about medical, like hospital, doctor's visits, insurance, and somebody else can deal with prescription drugs. And that somebody else, in the case of Aetna, that's actually CVS Caremark. But usually these are companies that ended up were once their own separate entities and are now kind of vertically integrated with health insurance companies. So you've got kind of that partnership where CVS Caremark bought Aetna. You've got Express Scripts is another example. So some people may have that as their PBM or Optum, and they'll often steer you to a preferred pharmacy that they want you to use. But those pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs are who's negotiating rebates with the drug companies. That's who actually is doing that kind of pricing piece of it. Is that's who's setting the price, right? It's not so much. Yes, the drug company can kind of set whatever price they want, but in terms of what they're going to really get paid for a drug, that negotiation is really not very transparent, because there's all kinds of rebates and those sort of elusive things that happen with the pharmacy benefit manager.
So what you're saying is PBM is another for-profit middleman in addition to our insurance companies that probably skims off some dollars before we ever get anything that helps our health. Is that
right? That definitely skims off some dollars, and we don't even know how much. And in fact, the insurance companies that they contract with don't even know how much.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So maybe this is a good time for me to ask, why do you feel like a single payer is the answer, basically, to this whole sort of clusterfuck?
Yeah, so I think that removing some of those middlemen or whatever you want to call them from the equation, whether that's insurance companies, whether that's pharmacy benefit managers, could be huge in terms of achieving more appropriate drug pricing, and also the ability to negotiate with pharma companies, right, would be really key for achieving more appropriate drug pricing. So I think that's all sort of like academically interesting, right? Like all those different pieces. But for me, like when I actually work with patients, the key thing is not like how much does this cost in some on a spreadsheet somewhere. It's how much does my patient have to pay to actually be able to access this medication. Right. And I think that's, to me, the biggest reason for Medicare for all or for a single payer system is that patients shouldn't have to pay a copay every single month to take a medicine they need to live, or a medicine they need to live with the quality of life that, you know, that they deserve to have. So yes, like there's all these like kind of great behind the scenes things that a single payer system would really allow us to simplify, but at the end of the day, for me, it's a patient being able to choose what pharmacy they want to use with a pharmacist that they trust, that they can walk into with their prescription and be able to get it filled there without someone telling them that's not an in-network pharmacy, and not having to pay for that medication.
Yeah, I like how simple that answer was. I mean, I think especially when we were sort of heavily involved in the Medicare for All movement, it's so tempting to get into all the sort of back of house stuff, like the things that happen behind the scenes with like industry and, you know, costs and middlemen and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, the reason we're fighting for this is just that so that whether you're walking to a doctor's office or a hospital or getting a drug that you need to have a healthy life, that there shouldn't be any major barriers to that, right? It's kind of as simple as that. So I had one question related to that, which is that, you know, when we look at countries that do have a Medicare for all type system, which is most, you know, developed countries in the world, one concern that we'll sometimes hear from folks is they're worried about there being one drug formulary nationally. So, and formulary is a term that folks might not run into in their day-to-day life, even though they are probably running into their insurance company's drug formulary. Can you explain kind of what a formulary is, and if we were to move to a Medicare for all system where there was kind of one list of, you know, drugs that are covered, drugs that are not covered, as well as a process for accessing drugs that aren't on the list, how is that something people should be worried about? Should it be something like, oh God, when we move to this national system, it's going to be one list of drugs that you can and can't have. There's going to be no exceptions. Is it better or worse than our current system?
So it would be pretty tough for it to be worse than our current system.
Fair.
I do expect that there would be a formulary in a single payer system, right? That's part of the negotiating process, right? Is of those Me Too drugs, picking only the few that make the most sense to keep on a formulary. But I know that formulary is kind of a stressful idea for some folks. I think, as you pointed out, everybody's current plan has a formulary. You probably didn't get to pick your current plan, your employer did, and you might not have even known the details of your pharmacy benefits. So certainly this wouldn't be worse.
Yeah, I think most people don't even know what a formulary is. I mean, or that they have one or anything, but sorry.
Mm-hmm. So I think that some of the benefits of this being one kind of universal formulary for everyone is that it's really transparent, right? Right now, if you go to your physician and they want to start you on one of those inhalers, right, that we mentioned earlier, they don't know what's on your specific plan when you have, I don't know, United Healthcare, but they contract with multiple PBMs and there's all different plans. And depending on your employer, there could even be a different plan for like a customized plan for them, right? So they don't know. They're sending a prescription kind of hoping that that's the one that's covered. Maybe it's not. You get to the pharmacy counter. There's this huge delay now in getting your medication because the pharmacist and the physician need to go back and forth about trying to figure out which one is actually covered under your insurance. So I think the nice thing about a sort of national or universal formulary would be that it'd be really clear and transparent. Imagine just being able to go to one website. The same formulary is true for everyone. And for the vast majority of medications and disease states, you can find the information you need to know there. And I think in the current system, non-system, and in a single payer future, there would be an exceptions process, right? There are medications that are really rarely needed. Someone with a bunch of different medication allergies, someone with a super rare disease where there's something kind of newer to market that may not have been incorporated into a formulary yet. There's always going to be an exceptions process. I love the idea of an exceptions process that is always the same, rather than me submitting a prior authorization or an appeal to an insurance company and not knowing if I'm going to hear back in 2 weeks or in 15 days or 30 days, or this plan actually is 60 days, and not knowing how I'm going to hear back. Are they going to call? Are they going to fax? Am I like, when should I follow up with them if I haven't heard anything? Again, this is just kind of delays in care. Whereas if I knew every single time, okay, the standard turnaround time for things where we really do need to go outside our normal formulary is this. This is how that'll get communicated back to me. This is how that will get communicated back to my patient. That really makes it a lot easier to navigate those unique situations.
Yeah, and I was just struck as you're talking about how similar what you're describing that pharmacists deal with is to like a hospital. The hospital bookkeepers who are trying to get their patients paid for by the same insurance companies. How it's just like really complex, knowing what's covered, what's not covered. And then insurance companies are always finding ways to sort of throw out denials, and then there's a whole fight and struggle to just kind of get what they should be covering in the first place. And it sounds like pharmacists are dealing with kind of the same thing, right? Just like endless bureaucracy. And, when you have private insurance, they obviously have an incentive not to provide these exceptions, right? They save money.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I navigate a lot of that paperwork and things in my role because I'm in clinics that are attached to a large academic medical center, and I'm in a specialty pharmacy setting. But even for my peers that work in community pharmacies, maybe you're not doing that paperwork or like necessarily having a ton of those fights the whole way through, but you're constantly getting pop-up screens of rejections that you now have to make a phone call or stop your workflow. And it's just more and more time that pharmacists are losing being able to talk with patients about this is what your medicine is, and this is how to get the most out of it, and this is how to take it safely and effectively, and being able to answer some of those questions. So I think it's really done a disservice to pharmacists that this system is continuing to get increasingly complex.
Yeah, and it's just another form, like this description, it sounds just like, physicians as well, calling and getting pre-auths and all that stuff. And it's just another form of rationing. The more time that providers are spending negotiating, the less time they're spending with patients. And that's also why it takes so freaking long to see a doctor or, to see a provider because, in addition to the fact that we have like a cap on the number of providers we can graduate every year, and then there's like other problems outside of like things that a single payer wouldn't necessarily directly solve, but just the fact that we would have these clear standards, that already frees up physician time to see more patients, and then of course the fact that if you've got if you're going to pay a less price for the same drugs, and that means the system overall has more money to put back into patients so that they can make the price lower for the patient. And so, there's just so many levels and kinds of rationing that happen here just because, we don't have a Medicare for all system.
Yeah. And absolutely. Pharmacy care is rationed in a lot of ways, right? Whether it's that kind of pull on the pharmacist's time or the pharmacy technician's time that something's wrong with this claim I'm trying to do, I have to call the insurance, or just even being able to have a pharmacy in certain areas. So I think the system we have is a huge contributor to pharmacy deserts. And it's still the case that, for most people that live in the United States, you are probably within 5 miles of a pharmacy. That's true, right? Like a vast majority of people are, but it may not even be a pharmacy you can use. Like we're having a huge issue on kind of the south and west side of Chicago right now, where one of the Medicaid plans is working with a PBM that won't cover prescriptions if they're not filled at a CVS pharmacy. We don't have that many CVS pharmacies on the south and west side of Chicago because they're not super profitable areas to have a pharmacy because of the payer mix.
So we're getting limited networks even with our pharmacies.
Yeah, completely. And our smaller independent pharmacies that maybe would have done some more patient-focused services for patients in the past, or maybe would have existed in more rural areas, those pharmacies are being cut out of network, so they're closing, or if they are still open, they may not be getting reimbursed for medications at even the rate it cost them to purchase the med in the first place. So we're losing pharmacies in a lot of vulnerable areas, the same way that we have, sort of general healthcare deserts. The same thing's happening with pharmacies.
Yeah, I think that we have so many more questions that we could ask about this, but it's been so great to have you on. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you feel like people should know about, how the pharmaceutical industry interacts with single payer?
Gosh, I guess my biggest maybe take home or takeaway about that would be that it is very rarely big pharma that's kind of creating the things that we actually need, right? Whether we're talking about the COVID vaccines or some of the other medications that we've kind of hit on before, Truvada or Sovaldi for hepatitis C, or these kind of breakthrough things that are happening. It's not really big pharma that's doing that for us. It's big pharma that's marketing that to us. So I think that would probably be my takeaway. And the Martin Shkreli reference from the beginning, that's actually how everybody operates. It's just that he really got roasted for it, right? But it's pretty wild to think that, he was made such an example of when that is the exact same kind of methods and techniques that happen throughout that industry.
Right, he said the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
So take away, the whole industry is a bunch of pharma bros. It's time to move on. Well, thanks you so much for sharing your expertise with us. This was really eye-opening to me. I've had very little chance to kind of hear about just how the pharmaceutical industry is working from folks who are on the pharmacy side of things. So that was really, really interesting. I learned a lot. I hope we can bring you back sometime soon.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.